So it gives us great pleasure to welcome once again both Professor Christophe Jaffrelot, Belorgey. Professor Jaffrelot is certainly not unknown to us and our neighborhood. So I will not belabor the point and say that nevertheless, I must introduce the speaker. I really don't need to say very much about him. Apart from the fact that he is probably one of his kind, a political scientist, an anthropologist, a historian, who has given South Asia studies a kind of approach which sometimes even political scientists and anthropologists who don't agree with each other and historians find compelling. And yet they find it very difficult to bracket him in one of the disciplines. But it really tells you that it is a new approach. The insights that he has brought into our understanding of South Asia studies have certainly made us think. So I did remember when he was talking of the rise of Dalits in politics. I really didn't think that it was going to happen, but it did happen. And he is just telling me that he has a book on Hindu nationalism, which is just out, which I will probably be using in the class that I will teach next term. But this particular topic that Professor Jaffrelot and his colleague from CNRS, Dr. Belorgey, are going to belabor upon is a very, very important topic. It's on the unique identity project. I can see Professor Balbir Arora also join us. Welcome, Professor Arora. So this is about the biometric project of India, which has moved in a certain direction. And I am not going to summarize his abstract, apart from saying that whenever Christophe has something to say, he has something surprising to say. And often you feel that it is not believable. But after some time, you actually begin to believe what he's saying. So without further ado, then, I hand over the floor to Christophe and to Nicolas. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Raoul. Thank you so much. And I want to also repeat something I've said when we met last time on Zoom. This network you have created at Heidelberg, or resurrected or perpetuated, is really invaluable. And we are very, very pleased with Nicolas to publish this presentation in your series of working papers. I have published papers in this series long time ago. My study of the 2002 pogrom was published in this series, and I really appreciated the quality of the work and the network and the publicity and so on. So congratulations, Raoul, for keeping up sometimes in difficult circumstances. So with Nicolas, we have worked together for now a couple of years on this topic of Adar. And as a preface to our presentation, I would like to say that it's a joint venture that has taken us to Delhi last year for interviews. We will refer to the interviews. Most of the people we interviewed are prepared to be named. Others want to remain anonymous. But the idea was, how do we explain the making of Adar? What is the history? And that's what I will speak about in the first part of this presentation. And Nicolas will look at the results. Nicolas is doing fieldworks, he is going very deeply into this matter, and will publish the book on Adar that we do need for sure in the coming years. So I'll be more historical, he'll be more on the present day situation. Since we are not, I would say, with the same degree of information about Adar, there is always an asymmetry there that is due to the fact that we are talking not only to Indians, but also to Europeans, to India specialists, but also to someone non-initiated people. I will, in the introduction, describe very, I would say, briefly, but I hope precisely, what is this? What is Adar? Before turning to the history and the narrative I have just mentioned. So if we go by the etymology first, Adar means foundation in Hindi. This is the base. This is a base for many things. And I'll return to this because we need to look at Adar in relation to other data sets or databases, information technologies, and so on. It was instituted in 2009 with the founding of a dedicated agency, the Unique ID Authority of India, UIDAI. And that was the creation largely of Nandan Nilekani, the co-founder of Infosys, and I will return to him in a minute. But let me first tell you what it is. It's a system that relies on the enrollment of people who provide their biometric information for collection. 10 fingerprinting, a scan of both irises, and you also give the name, your name, date of birth, address, and optionally, phone number and email. These that are collected across the country in dedicated enrollment kiosks. I'll return to that. It can be the whole of a post office or a bank. And then the data, roughly 3 megabytes per person, are sent by internet to this agency, the UIDAI. The central server of the UIDAI is the repository where these information are centralized. And they are centralized, therefore, in something that is called the Central Identities Data Repository, CIDR. Here, algorithms run checks for duplication, a very important phase, and generates a random 12-digit number, the famous Adar number. You know, when you're asked your Adar number, this is what it is. Then the applicant received a paper card bearing this number, but the card hardly matters, really. The idea is to dematerialize as much as possible the whole process. And at the other end, when a person needs to prove his or her identity during an authentication procedure, they provide the number. And it's an identification process in the first place. So when the response is yes, it means that both things match, and this is when you can have access to some rights. When it doesn't, and we'll return to that, you are in trouble. When your Adar number doesn't help you to get identified, you're in trouble. So who had the idea of this system in the first place? You know, I'm now looking at the history, the trajectory of this idea. Well, what Nicolas and I have discovered, because we had no idea of this in the first place, was that the project was initially conceived by the corporate sector. You know, it is the brainchild of the IT sector of India. And we understand easily why. Because for information and communication technologies, to identify users is a crucial matter. And this is something you can see when you look at e-commerce sites. You know, online sellers can track visitors to their website. And that enables them to adjust prices based on what they deduce of clients are willing to pay. These systems arm them with the means to make the consumer spend more than they initially intended. So to track the customers online is clearly one of the most important objectives of the corporate sector when it aims at the identification of the customers. Now, you have the well-known case of online air ticket pricing. That's a very good illustration. With each visit that a particular user makes on a seller's website, the price rises. So that's the core initial, if you want, birthplace of this idea. But of course, in India, the identification of individuals is problematic. And the key question for the IT sector of India was, in the early years of this century, how do you make identification of the customers reliable? Well, many people bear the same name. Often names are not spelled the same way. There are different documents for the same person. Dates of birth may be uncertain. In fact, in many documents, you have 1st of January as an assigned date because the birth date is uncertain. So in such a context, statistical reliability of data mining is in free fall. And therefore you can't use what you can use as a technique in more developed countries. And this is why ICT companies, information communication technology companies join hands to create a reliable, unique identifier based on biometric technology. That is why they started. And interestingly, immediately they got the support of non-profits organizations such as the Gates Foundation, such as the Omidyar Foundation, and the World Bank was definitely interested in a project that should result in productivity, in more productivity. As I said, the person who played a major role in this initial phase was Nandan Nilekani, who was at that time the vice president of Infosys, and who had really developed Infosys in a big way. With Nicolas, we looked at the trajectory of Infosys, and it's a meteoric rise under the leadership of course, Narayan Murthy as well as Nandan Nilekani. Infosys reported turnover of $1.6 million in 91, and that had become a $3 billion figure in 2007. 2007 is, of course, the last date when the rise was linear, because 2008, the Great Recession affected the world and the US in particular, and because of this also the IT sector of India. And you saw many NRIs who are employed in the US coming back, and Nandan Nilekani will be in a position to also use these people immediately almost for his project. This project is made public exactly at the same time. In the book that Nandan Nilekani published in 2008, Imagining India, where you read, and I'll quote, "When I first became involved in the public sphere, I consciously avoided pitching IT as a means of solving public problems. I was wary of being labeled a computer boy who saw every problem as something that could be solved by writing a piece of code. But after a decade of work on public issues, I do not see how things can be improved in the public sector without a massive dose of IT." Now, that's a philosophy to which we will return. You can call it technologism. IT can be seen as the solution. Digital India can be seen as the solution for the rest of India, for the whole of India. So this is the time, 2008, when Nandan Nilekani and his colleagues decide to promote the idea of what will become Adar. They will do that by joining hands for forming a new entity, the Indian Software Product Industry Roundtable, iSpirit, a very important network, still very active, made of IT and corporate people, who published, they published soon after a kind of vision where they considered biometric information as the most reliable base for what they will call India Stack. And that's why Adar is well named as the basis, because they consider that if you register everybody biometrically, you will be in a position to have the base for many more things, for many other layers. And 4 layers can rely on Adar. First, a presence-less layer that helps identify your customer. That's the first use that I have mentioned before. This is the famous Know Your Customer, the EKYC ID. A paperless layer or DigiLocker, which helps authenticate and store digitized documents. A cashless layer, which enables payments beyond 2 people who have thus been identified via the new unified payment interface that Indians know, most of them. And last but not least, the consent layer, through which the individual would authorize third parties to manage their data. This is the India Stack, and Adar is the base for all these developments. The problem was that to enroll 1.3 billion people, the corporate sector needed the state. And the first thing to do was to persuade the government of India to support this initiative. How was the state to be convinced? Well, we are in a very interesting context, and that's why to look at the recent history of India is necessary for making sense of Adar. You may remember the UPA government at that time certainly had embarked on economic liberalization, but also on a policy of redistribution to the poor. You will remember RTI Act, the RTI Act 2005, the National Rural Employment Guarantee Act, NREGA, same year, the National Food Security Act that came much later for the provision of food grains, and of course, national pension schemes, direct benefits transfer for LPG cylinder subsidies. Well, there was some tension between the liberalization leg and the redistribution leg of the UPA government. And it was something that helped the promoters of Adar because they could tell the government, look, one of the problems you're facing for justifying your redistribution policies comes from the leakages in social benefit schemes. That is criticized and somewhat legitimately criticized. So the first argument that could bear dividends, that could drive dividends for the promoters of Adar, was the idea that if you replace the PDS, the public distribution system, which had many sources for leakages because of the many intermediaries, with a direct transfer of benefits in cash, you may be in a position to somewhat diffuse the critiques that you were facing, challenging critiques that you were facing. And there, the finance, or if you want, the financial arm of the government, and Pranab Mukherjee in the first place, as finance minister, played a big role for persuading Manmohan Singh and others, including Rahul Gandhi, that Adar could help to fix leakages. And if you have this digital identification, you have a practical solution for solving a long-standing problem. That's the main argument that will result in the involvement of the state. By 2009, Nandan Nilekani is appointed with the rank of minister at the helm of this UIDAI. He has a direct access to Manmohan Singh, and he will make allies. I think we do think with Nicolas that the first allies he was able to make were from a completely different milieu, the bureaucracy. He was certainly not a bureaucrat, and we have interviewed people who told us when we saw Nandan joining the government, we could not believe our eyes because he came from a completely different universe, a universe in which the suspicion vis-a-vis the state is tremendous. He needed to make friends on the bureaucracy side, and he did. And he did by recruiting as the first executive director of UIDAI, Ram Sevak Sharma, whom we have interviewed at length. We have just published a book on Adar, by the way. And Sharma was an IAS officer, but a very atypical IAS officer, because he had gone to IIT Kanpur. He had followed computer science in California, and he was largely the man who helped Nandan Nilekani to relate to the bureaucracy the right way. So it's interesting in terms of the decision-making process. For us, the Adar story is a story that is an entry point to the way governance is working in India. I'm sorry to say it now, I should have said it before, but we are not telling a story that is just on a technological tool. No, it's a story that gives us an idea of how do you make things happen in the Indian governing system. Well, that's one of the interesting resources we identified, this kind of joint venture or, if you want, alliance or partnership between the corporate sector and the bureaucracy. Well, I cut a long story short because that would take us too far. But not only they needed the central bureaucracy, but they needed the state governments. So they spent a lot of time also to tour some states and to convince some state bureaucracies, including Jharkhand. Sharma is a Jharkhand cadre. So they use this state that is not the most developed state in India, as a laboratory with the support of the bureaucracy of that state. Then they initiated a public-private partnership that was quite sophisticated. They made sure that they could subcontract most of the data collection process. And that was certainly one of the problems in terms of safety. We return to that, security of the data which were collected. But the bureaucracy certainly was a facilitator. The most active actors, if you want, of the data collection process were all small startups, private companies. Then, when that was achieved, you needed to proceed. And one of the issues they had to solve was, where do you get the technology? And the digital deduplication process was a technological challenge on such a vast scale. That was the main. How do you make sure that you do not record, register the same person twice? And the fingerprints were not sufficient for making this distinction. Even the irises were not sufficient. You needed very sophisticated technological tools. Only French and American companies were capable of doing this on this sufficient scale. And mind you, this is probably the best kept secret. At least we will not be able to too many details on that. We do know that the French company Sagem gave most of the technology, some of the technology. We don't know what was the price. What we've learned is that even this technology was not 100%, I would say, accurate. And that's something Sharma himself admitted in one of the interviews. He says, the iris plus fingerprints make it possible to have an accuracy of 99%. Nothing can be 100% accurate. Now, this recognition of the limitation of the technology is very interesting because it means that it's as if you admitted that 13 million Indians would not be in a position to be authenticated by this system. And that's the first caveat, there may be many others, that I wanted to highlight, because it means that you have a technological solution that cannot work for everybody. It cannot be a universal system. And you assume that, yes, a portion, a fraction, a small fraction of population will remain outside. Later on, he will say 5%, not 1%, but at that time he said 1%. Well, one of the reasons is that you have the poor quality of the manual laborers' fingerprints. The fingerprints of manual laborers are erased and cannot be easily detected. When we pushed him, Sharma admitted that and said, well, we have always said that you need to create an exceptional handling mechanism because Adar works for 99% of the cases. Sorry, 95% of the cases. There may be an issue with 5%. So you please handle these cases yourself and do not completely depend too much on technology. You are not robots. No, this is the idea that, well, yes, we will go for a technical solution of identification, but we know it's not 100%. So at the grassroots level, you have to be a human being. Of course, that's the main problem. How do you know that the person in charge in the, I don't know, PDS shop or whatever, will indeed consider that if you cannot get your Adar authentication, can you get your due? In many cases, that did not work. And we'll return to that. Plus, we'll return to that. That's one of the problems. Another problem is due to the fact that many fake cards, fake authentication tools, devices developed in a rather pervasive manner. Now we have so many fraud, so many instances of fraud. Just a couple of instances. In Kanpur, a gang collected the fingerprints of users whose Adar numbers therefore were stolen, and they could resell the replicas for 5,000 rupees a piece. And that was, of course, responsible for thousands of corrupt practices. In fact, the UIDAI had to blacklist more than 49,000 people in this particular case. So it was not 100% in terms of how you record the fingerprints. It was not 100% either in terms of security. The integrity of the data recorded were compromised because of fraud. It was also compromised because of leakages. So many leaks took place. 13 leaks were discovered in 2017. And that was because of servers of state governments most of the time. Then came one of the major problem for the UIDAI. How do you convince people to enroll? What is the motivation? Why should they give their fingerprints, especially if the system is robust, but not 100% safe? Well, the state, because it had invested in it, had to convince the citizens of India to register. They had to create a sense of need among the people for having an Adar number. And they started with carrots. You saw, for instance, the Ministry of External Affairs issuing passports in record time for citizens who furnish their number. But they also use the stick, if you want. So many public banks push their clients to link their bank account to their Adar number, sometimes threatening to freeze their accounts if they did not comply. And that's one of the reasons why you saw people registering. They enrolled because in many cases, it was as if that was mandatory and not optional. And that is something we documented. So many people gave testimonies saying, well, I was asked for my Adar number for being accepted in hospitals. There was a case in February 2018 in Gurgaon when a young woman who was in labor gave birth on the parking lot of an hospital that was asking for the Adar number. There were so many other examples. Adar numbers were asked for any kind of reasons. So it became a kind of legal obligation, even though it was not legal. And I turn to the next phase that brought the judiciary in the picture. Adar was not legally mandatory, has never been legally mandatory. But the judiciary took a long time for intervening in this history. If you look at the judicial story trajectory, you realize that as early as September 2013, the Supreme Court was asked to intervene. And on 5 occasions between September 2013 and October 2015, the court repeated, no person should suffer for not getting the Adar number. But they postponed again and again the day when they would decide for good, the day when they would give their verdict, so to speak. And you have to wait for September 2018, a long-awaited judgment, where when the judiciary decided that enrollment would be mandatory for certain social rights, but optional for commercial services. And we'll return to that when we look at the Adar Act, because that's very much related to the Adar Act. So that's the first, I would say, section of this first part, giving you an idea of how gradually Adar became kind of fait accompli. And that's a word that is very meaningful in this context. Now, what about the opposition? When the opponents, political as well as civil society, NGO people. But it's very interesting to see that Parliament was immediately very interested in Adar and paid attention as early as 2009 to this initiative, this innovation, asking for a bill, asking for a law, make Adar a piece, an institution that would have been validated by Parliament. So a bill was tabled as early as the fall of 2010 in the Rajya Sabha. But the Parliamentary Standing Committee on Finance, that was chaired by Yashwant Sinha at that time, a BJP member, rejected the bill, saying that it was in violation of parliamentary rights. And the UIDAI had started functioning without the authorization of Parliament. And that was it. It was rejected, stuck, but the process of collecting data was continuing in parallel. When Narendra Modi took over power in 2014, he was a very strong critic of Adar. He had said that such a gimmick should not survive, except that he became a very zealous convert of the system after meeting Nandan Nilekani and Sharma, realizing the huge potential of Adar, especially in terms of surveillance, and we'll return to that. So he pushed for a bill. The BJP government was interested in presenting the Adar Targeted Delivery of Financial and Other Subsidies, Benefits and Services Act bill in 2016. And you must remember, you probably remember that the government, because it did not have the majority in the Rajya Sabha, passed this bill in Parliament as a money bill, and the only type of legislative text that does not require voting by the upper house. And that's clearly an abuse of power, like many others. But to use the Adar Act, to pass the Adar Act as a money bill, was definitely an abuse of power. Then the Supreme Court intervened again, because for the reasons I've mentioned before, there were illegal provisions in this act. It took a long time again, but in August 2017, Supreme Court gave a verdict that was really like a Janus, very, I would say, ambivalent, ambiguous verdict. On the one hand, the judges declared the right to privacy was a fundamental right under the Indian Constitution, something the Government of India had denied. But on the other hand, they considered that privacy, I cite, I quote, is not absolute and cannot prevent the state from making laws imposing reasonable restrictions, which meant that they validated the Adar Act. And in the final of 2018 that I have referred to before, a 9-judge bench of the Supreme Court finally delivered this lengthy verdict of 1,448 pages. And they decided to render Adar mandatory for social welfare programs. They made it mandatory for paying income tax, but they confirmed that Adar was optional for commercial services, such as banks and telecoms. This is Article 57 of the Adar Act, as well as other public uses, pension and school admission. The government bypassed the hurdle of excluding commercial services, an ordinance that became a law subsequently, amending 2 laws, the Prevention of Money Laundering Act and the Telegraph Act, in such a manner as to make it possible to send data from the Adar database to banking authorities and telephone operators. And that's a very important technique of bypassing the Supreme Court judgment. Ultimately, the state's driving determinations overruled reservations of the Supreme Court. And we have finally, as I said, a fait accompli. Soon after, in July 2018, and I will end my part with this, Justice Sri Krishna, at the helm of Commission on the need to protect privacy in India, published a report, released a report, saying that a personal data protection bill had to be tabled in the parliament. And it's interesting because it was something the civil rights activists, so many activists to whom Nicolas will refer in a minute, where we're asking for this data protection bill. That was July 2018. We are still waiting for a law protecting personal data in India. But you see how this issue is closely related to the Adar story, because the Adar story shows that, and I summarize my argument in a couple of sentences, we've seen the technophiles of the IT sector and the state in its different incarnations, including the bureaucracy, joining hands for, well, promoting their interest, mutual interest, in commercial terms, as well as in, if you want, disciplinary terms, even surveillance terms, at the expense of at least a legal framework for protecting personal data. And that was not the only problematic result of Adar. Nicolas will now tell you more about other results which have been not so positive for the citizens of India.
Thanks, Christophe. We are now, I think, about 45 minutes into the presentation. How long will you take?
Well,
about 40 minutes into the presentation. How long will you take?
I think I will have to make it short, so I think 20 minutes.
Yeah, if you can make it 15 minutes, that would be great. Then there'll be half an hour for question and answer.
Okay.
Or try to do that. It's not 20 minutes. Okay, thanks.
Okay. Can you see my screen?
Sure.
Good. So I will just continue what Christophe has been saying and talking now about the results of Adar. So for that, I will take a political science perspective, that of Laswell, a classical one, and just ask a simple question: who gets what, when, and how? And to answer this question, I will consider in turn three kinds of actors: the firms, the states, and the people. So let's begin with the firms. We can say that for the firms, especially in the digital sector, Adar is a long-term investment, and profits are not here yet, or not always here yet. So first of all, we witnessed an increase in the transaction volumes. The mechanism for that is quite simple. It has been stated by ID4D, body which Christophe told us about at the beginning. It is the most important feature that Adar allowed is the lowering in the onboarding cost of customers. At the beginning, if you are, say, a bank and you want to have a new customer, it costed you around 1,500 rupees. Thanks to Adar, these costs may plummet to as little as 10 rupees. And we see on this picture too that Mukesh Ambani himself said that Adar enabled us, it is Jio, for instance, to acquire 1 million customers a day, which is something really huge, which is unheard, I quote, in the industry as a whole. So let's continue with Jio and the telecom case, globally speaking. You probably remember in September 2016, so 7 years after the launch of Adar, Jio launched a very low price offer. There were some dumping accusations, but they were discarded, and a price war followed that. On this picture on the top right, you can see the data price per GB in the industry, and thanks to this price war, it becomes really low. At the same time, on the below graph, you can see the hike in the total data volumes and data usage per customer. So really, thanks to this easier authentication, you had a hike in the volumes. Here you can see the transformation of the market. Jio takes the first position. And you could, if I had some more time, I could tell you the same story for the payment system, where the UPI, Unified Payment Interface, which is Adar-based, also saw a very high increase in the volume. But, and this is my second point for the firms, the profits were not, did not come very quickly. They remained, and they still remain uncertain. Let's take again the case of telco. And if you look at the accountability of Jio, and for instance, if you look into a Reliance annual report for the year 2019, officially, there are some increases in the volumes, even in the benefits. But if you look at it closer, you have some concerns about sustainability. Why? First of all, because the average revenue per user in the telecom sector has fallen to 41%. That is really a huge proportion. And some financial analysts even pretended that GEO's tariffs were only 2/3 of the full tariffs, that is 2/3 of the actual costs. As a consequence, about 4/5 of GEO balance sheet would be funded by debt and by the mother firm, by Reliance itself. Then you have some more deeper accountability issues. But the global idea is that they were losing money, probably, most probably, at that time. But you may recall that the debt of GEO has been eventually backed in 2020 by whom? By the big GAFAM, Google, Apple, Facebook, and so on. More precisely, Facebook bought more than $5 billion to GEO. Google also brought nearly $5,000, and other actors from the digital sectors brought a lot of money too. Why? Because it was an investment. The money was not here now, but because of the data collection enabled by Adar and through phones, through the smartphones, the perspective for profits are tremendous. As a mobile operator, GEO is a much knowing entry point for data collection. What you do on your smartphone is known by them, and now probably by Facebook and Google too. There are other ways used, like streaming, GeoMart, and so on. And so it is most probably Adar has been a tool for the GAFAM to get to the Indian data cleaned with Adar. This is, for the time being, still an hypothesis, but a most probable one. So this was for the firm. Let's come now to the second kind of actor, the state. A lot has been written on the economies allowed by Adar for the central state and for the states and union territories in India. So let's dive into this issue once again. One of the first studies on the project was done in 2012 by the National Institute for Public Finance and Policy, NIPFP. And we call it the matrix of all studies, because after it has always been the same story again and again. At this time, the results of this study were that Adar allowed a huge saving of 10 to the power of 12 rupees in 10 years. That is to say, an internal rate of return of more than 50%. So the message behind this study was that, yes, Adar will allow huge economies for the state. So it is very interesting for the state. The limits of this study, however, have been highlighted very quickly by some activists, for instance, by Ritika Kera. And one of the first limits is that this study had been was not really completely, totally independent, because it has been paid by the UIDAI at a time where it still had to struggle inside the state to get green light for the program. Second limit is that the data at that time were available only for NREG and for the PDS, and for the rest they have been extrapolated. The extrapolation exercise was not an easy one, and after some exchanges of articles in EPW, the NIPFP study was not heard anymore. Now, few people even remember it. The second big study that came was 4 years after. It was a World Bank report, 2016. This report was called Digital Dividends. So it was a report worldwide. But India was quoted as a core example of the digital dividends. And for instance, it was written that thanks to Adar, there was a saving of $11 billion a year this time. So it is nearly 8 times the result of the NIPFP study. But to get to this result itself was very much attacked, and nowadays is not robust at all. Why? There are 2 main caveats. First caveat is that, once again, this study was based mainly on the LPG situation. So, first study was quote, it is a thesis from Columbia University, from Prabhat Banwal. And in this study, it is said that Adar will allow, for LPG only, 1 billion saving a year. Strangely, this level was doubled a few months later in a New York Times article. It was said that Adar allowed a $2 billion a year saving. So there were a lot of discussions about that, and after that, there was some retractation from the authors of this study, saying that the saving were not real, but only potential. And after, a little later, the Comptroller and Auditor General of India itself made a report on this case study, and found that 82% of the pretended saving did not come from the reduction in leakages, what was the point at the beginning, but just from lower price of petroleum. That is to say that the real saving resulting from Adar was very, very low. The second caveat of the World Bank study was again about extrapolation. What happened exactly? The World Bank wrote that the World Bank used another study from the consulting group to assist the poor, CGAP, a think tank akin to ID4D, based in Washington, funded by the World Bank, but also by Microsoft and Omidyar Network. And this study said that a big amount went in social and in public expenses. And the World Bank made a mistake. It said that the global budget, the World Bank took the global budget for the potential saving. So after a while, they also had to retract and said, no, sorry, it was not our point. The around 11% we said we discovered come from other sources, and they changed the argument to get to the same result. So this was very strange. And if we look now at the existing literature to get to know what are the economies for the states resulting from Adar, we get the following table. So in each different field, for instance, if you consider the first row for NREG, so you had the NIPFP study, which said, yes, savings are important. But At the beginning only, now we don't know. Then the World Bank said, yes, savings for NREG are important, but due to the problem I mentioned, it was not thanks to Adar that this saving can come, but only thanks to smart cards. That is a completely different device. And so we cannot use it for Adar. Then you have other studies, for instance, by Dres, Kera, and Somanchi, who are saying, no, for NREG, Adar is not bringing any benefits. And then you have a study from Moalidaran, Nihaus, and Suktankar, who said, yes, there are some benefits, but only through smart cards, again, not through Adar. For the PDS, I won't make all the table, but just consider the PDS because it is a very important program. Same idea for the NIPFP study. Then for the World Bank, after the rectification, the World Bank study cannot say anything on PDS. Study from Dreskira and Somanchi says the economies for the state are very low. And another study by Muralidhara, Nihaus, and Suktankar said no, for the PDS, there have been no economies for the state. And so on and so forth. So you can see, what you can see more on this table, unfortunately, are the gray areas. That means we have no data to get an accurate estimate of what have been the real economies for the state. And most of the data that we have are negative. That is to say, no, there have been no or very small economies for the state. The most positive ones are not linked to Adar, but to smart cards. Let's come now to the results for the people. Three big kind of results. First, efficiency gains. Second, denials of social rights. And then threats on privacy and on political liberties. The narrative of efficiency gains is to be found mainly in some reports, like the State of Adar report, that is once again funded by Omidyar Network. And the idea is that Adar has supported inclusion, and that for many residents, Adar has improved service delivery. We also have some direct narratives from people, for instance, explaining that.
Is still speaking.
Hello? Can you hear me?
A little louder would be better. Yeah, a little louder would be better.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, this is better.
Yes. Some people also explain direct efficiency gains, like no, you can have many examples, but I won't quote it at length because we have not much time. So just keep in mind that for the middle class, we have different proofs of efficiency gains for different people. One most numerous issue, but one most quantitatively important issues is the denial of social rights, mostly for the poor. If we now think a little to the global picture of social policy in India, we must recognize first that among the many problems that the welfare schemes faced, the UID Adar addressed only a minor one. The main issues, what are they? For the PDS, it is malnutrition. For the NREG, it is unemployment. And globally, the political issue is which is the level of redistribution through the state and what is the effectiveness of entitlements for the beneficiaries of these social programs. So from a political perspective, we have two symmetrical issues. The first is the effectiveness of entitlements. What was the situation in, let's say, at the beginning of the 2000 in 2010, around 2010? So in the case of PDS, the effectiveness of entitlement was impaired by the shift from universal to targeted PDS, by some misclassification of people, by insufficient food intake for some people. What has Adar to do with that? Not many things. The other issue is the effectiveness of fraud. And this is the issue that Adar proponents highlighted. Adar was supposed to reduce the fraud. So in this chapter, we have to mention the high level of corruption. And if we precise what kind of fraud we have to deal with, we find three kinds of fraud. First, identity fraud. What is it? It is I pretend to be entitled, I pretend to be someone entitled to food, and I get this food. So this is identity fraud. Second is eligibility fraud. I'm not pretending to be someone else, but I only pretend to be eligible, to be entitled to some food, which in fact I am not. Okay. The third fraud is quantity fraud. That is to say, a shopkeeper, instead of giving 5 kilos, will give only 4 or 3. Now, take Adar and put it inside the picture. What happens? It happens that Adar solved the identity fraud issue, but not the eligibility fraud and the quantity fraud issues. So identity fraud was solved, but it was a limited fraud. On the other hand, the quantity fraud and the eligibility fraud are very much related to corruption in the last mile delivery, and this corruption has not disappeared. Many studies find that quantity fraud persists at around the same level before and after the introduction of Adar. The overall leakage, that is the difference between the value disbursed by the government on the one hand and the value received by the people on the other hand, this overall leakage was not reduced by Adar. And nowadays, activists continue to act at the ground level against corruption. There are many journals, many newspaper articles about that. I'll just quote one or two. Besides, concerning the PDS, some ameliorations were already underway, like the informatization, not through Adar, but through smart cards. You also had a better surveillance of food transport. That is a big place for leakage. So Adar was just solved some minor issues, if we want to summarize this point. Another point, the second point for social right issue, is that Adar acted as a supplementary hurdle for people to access their rights. So how did it create new troubles? First, you had the need to enroll. So it took some time, it took some energy. It was not always free. It was difficult. It was a new hurdle. Then you have your Adar number to be correctly linked, seeded, as it is officially said, to your ration card or to your bank account, You have different articles on this issue. Then you need that there is no issue with the payments for NREG, for instance, and they are issues. You have a diverted payment case. You may remember the Airtel scam, where Airtel opened bank accounts without the beneficiaries knowing it. And through the internal logic of Adar, the Adar money came on this new opened account. And so people could not get it because they didn't know there was some money in these accounts. You have also the case of delayed payments in NREG. You have now
Nicolas,
other payments.
excuse me. We are almost at 3:30 now.
Okay, so I will
just wrap up. Yeah, we have then about 15 minutes for question and answer.
Yeah, I will finish very quickly. So let's jump now to the third consequence for the people: economic and political endangerment. Let us talk briefly about economic issues. Adar is now linked to a series of different files that can be used by private sector for advertisement, targeting, or for surveillance.
Can you bring your mic closer to the?
Yes, sorry.
Yeah.
Is it better? Is it better?
So this is very good. This is very good.
Yeah. You also have political issues. We have spoken a little about privacy concerns. I quote a proponent of Adar, so someone who was very, so a proponent of the scheme. He's now saying, another thing I'm concerned about is the human right aspect and what happens if it all falls in the wrong hands. So you should obviously not put this technology in a dictatorial regime, but if you put it in a good regime and then it changes and falls into a totalitarian system, it's highly dangerous. And you have much political concern because now both National Population Register and the National Register of Citizens make use of Adar. So people who at the beginning were very happy to enroll in Adar because it gave them an identity, a way to be recognized, are fearing that it will be a way to exclude them because they are registered, they are known, everything is linked to their Adar number, but because of the CAA and the current political situation, it may become a tool to exclude them from their entitlements. So here you have a summary of the results. We can come back later to that. Would just like to conclude quickly 3 points. From a technological perspective, now the basic map drawn by Adar, that is to say with numbers only, covers around 92% of the territory. 92% of the population have numbers. On this basic map, you have additional layers, that is a link between Adar and other databases, like customer databases in the private sector, like state resident data hubs for states, and so on. And the compilation of all these layers into single hands would make the project a very dangerous weapon against the population, because at this time you would have global targeting possible. The second main point is that we have winners and losers. The winners are mostly the firms from the digital sector, and the losers are mainly the vulnerable parts of the population, who face identifications trouble and difficult to access their social rights. And now, if we look at the historical significance of this scheme, it may become an illustration of the theory of the unintended consequences. That is to say, it was done for good, and we hope it will not become something done for bad. And so eventually, I must say that it is close to a form of surveillance that, like the one depicted by Michel Foucault a long time ago, and amplified today by the power of the digital technology. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you, Christophe. and thank you, Nicolas. We have, I think, a very fascinating account. I don't want to say much at this point. I might just wrap up in 2 minutes at the end. But since time is running short, I would like to collect some questions and then get the speakers to respond. So can we now move into the gallery view? Yes. Yes, Professor Arora, then Dr. Himanshu Jha. Please come in, Professor Arora.
Thank you, Rahul, and a big thank you to Christophe and Nicolas for an outstanding treatment of a topic which is extremely complex, both in its history and its political and judicial ramifications. My question is specifically, what is the dose of subterfuge and deception that has been used to impose Aadhaar? And the link to that is the question relating to the judiciary. The judiciary agrees on principles, but falls short on implementation. We are seeing this in the question of bail under the Terrorist Act, that they won't strike it down, but it is not to be cited as precedent. So what is the value that we can attach to the right to privacy that was enshrined by the judiciary? Thank you.
Yes, Himanshu, please come in with your question.
Thank you, Christophe and Nicolas, for this fascinating presentation. And hello to Professor Arora, my former teacher from JNU. Good to see you. My question is about the state and the processes within the state. And, the story of Adar is that, it started out as a non-statutory program, as you have already pointed out. And the Congress was, from the beginning, was hesitant on this program. And as you have said, after the meeting with Narendra Modi, Nilekani convinced him, and there was subsequent amendment to, there were new rules introduced, there was subsequent amendment, there was a new act. And so, Adar has kind of moved in a certain direction after 2014. And so isn't Adhar's story is also about the uptake of policy ideas within the state and how ideas can move in a certain direction, towards an objective. That is one. Or is it about political will? Or is it about agency of certain people like Nandan Nilekani himself? But, I was curious to know about the role of Ajay Bhushan Pandey, who is somewhat of an agent who is representing continuity from 2010, and now he's the CEO of UIDAI. So some reflections on that. Thank you.
I think Professor Suranjan Das has a question as well.
Yeah, thank you, Rahul. Could I first say a very big thank you to Christophe and Nicolas for the wonderful presentation. I have a very methodological point to raise. How valid is it to view India in isolation so far as a problematic of relating digitization and biometrics to the entire notion of state surveillance on the one hand, and the use of biometrics and digitization for the corporatization of governance? We see it in the USA, we see it in England, you see it in Europe. When we were students and were asking for visa, biometrics was not used. But you now go for visa for any country in the West, you need biometrics. So why do we have to isolate India to understand this process? Isn't it better in terms of methodology to see it in the broader prospect of surveillance all the world over, democratic state or non-democratic state alike?
And I think there can be a final question by Mr. Anish Mishra.
Yes, thank you, Professor Jaffrelot, for the amazing presentation that you gave. So my question on the Adar card scheme is that if you were to understand this scheme, I mean, it was not a phenomenon that just happened in recent terms, and if you study this, you know, it's a process that actually took place over time. So do you think that the phenomenon of Aadhaar card in India can be actually understood through the lens of gradual institutional change? Some comments that I will make is that this idea actually came up in 1999 after the Kargil War, and then it was in the Vajpayee government where there was this idea that, especially in the border regions, you know, there was a need to implement a multi-purpose identification card in India. And over time, you know, the Adar scheme came. I mean, then the NDA government came. In fact, the Adar brand itself was not a product of the BJP. It was the Manmohan Singh government that actually, you know, launched the brand name Adar card. And what Prime Minister Modi did, the only thing he did was to fund the scheme and implement the ideas. And we can say that the turning point here was the 2014 Nilekani, the meeting between Nilekani and Prime Minister. So the question here is, what exactly caused this change, you know, from you know, the Congress from supporting Aadhaar card to moving to the opposition and, you know, opposing Aadhaar card, and Modi from actually opposing the Aadhaar card to supporting the Aadhaar card. So what's the causal mechanism that you actually see here? That's my first question. And a very short second question is that this study that you've done, which is really amazing, you see the ability of generalization of your research to actually explain this phenomenon in other part of the world. I mean, Professor Jaffrelot, you have written books on Pakistan, and Pakistan has also a similar scheme called the CNI scheme, the Computer National Identification Card scheme. So two questions is that on gradual institutional change, and the second was on the ability of this research to be generalized to explain the phenomenon in other parts of the world. Thank you.
Okay, there's just one more question on the chat box, which says that it is factually incorrect that DBT came after 2014. DBTL, which I studied, was rolled out in August 2013. There is a technocratic governing ideology of the Indian state that both ruling parties have acquiesced to, from Srinivas Yaramsetti. This question kind of connects with the idea that, you know, certain ideas within the state, you know, ascend to power. So I would like you, Christophe, to reflect on what was it, to what extent can you make it a kind of a class-based argument, that the IT sector was a favored sector and they were able to transact their interests, as opposed to much more ideas and state-based argument, that, you know, certain ideas actually gained ground within the state, which helped the IT sector negotiate the trajectory that you have just described. The floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, and we will respond jointly with Nicolas. I'll try to speak less this time. Sorry about that. Well, these are great questions. I'll try to do justice to them in the right order. I mean, I will pick and choose, of course, but begin with Balvir's question. You know, clearly the judiciary has been terribly ambivalent before 2014 and even more after 2014. And in fact, we've interviewed lawyers, including Karuna Nundi, on this, and we cite her in the paper that will be released very soon. And she says it's a contempt. It was in violation of court's orders that Adar was implemented. And she said, well, people should go to jail for that. This will not happen. And instead, government said that, well, we have done it now, and we have spent a lot of money, and most people have it, so it is working fine. We will all keep it. No, this is the definition of a fait accompli. Adar was a fait accompli, and the law came to vindicate it many years later. So it's a case, it's a typical study of judiciary malfunctioning for the last, 6 years, 7 years, at least 4 years. We've seen this as a routine matter in India. How can the Adar bill be considered as legal in the first place, as a money bill? How can you look at Adar as the Adar bill as a money bill? So that would take us too far, but clearly the judges either have been blackmailed or have shared the ideology. And I'll return to Raul's question, because we may see there some affinities in terms of ideology, or they were waiting for a post-retirement sinecure. Whatever the reason, they have not done their job, clearly. So it's just a way to illustrate the malfunctioning of the judiciary one more time. Suranjan, yes and no. Yes, we have to look at this in a larger perspective. It's not India only, it's all over. And it's all over the world. People think that we have the technology, why shouldn't we use it? It is safer, it is quicker, it is more effective. And safety is prevailing over liberty all over the world. You know, the need for security is prevailing over the need for liberty. And that is one of the reasons why what is going on in India is going on elsewhere. With two caveats, at least one. Privacy laws, like the one the EU has issued recently, can protect citizens more than others. So yes, the problem is global, but the solutions are not for the moment. And some countries, including India for the moment, are not doing anything for protecting the privacy. And personal data are not as safe as in some other places. And here is, hence the second caveat, that will be a problem. India will have a problem if it has no privacy law for relations with the EU, for instance. Many companies will not be able to deal with India if the data are not safe enough. So globalization, yes, but up to a point, and some deglobalization may be at work there. New borders are emerging. The way you protect the privacy of the data is a border, is a red line, a new red line, a digital red line. And the last point on this, and that would be on the side of the yes, Suranjan, it's global in the sense that people are exporting these technologies. And what we discovered with Nicolas while we were doing fieldwork was that Adar is an export product. Adar is now something you see in Africa, in other places. And, you know, interestingly, you have countries like Kenya who say, where the judges say, no, but look at the Adar verdict. There is a minority verdict there, a minority verdict that says we don't want it because we want privacy. And that's one of the examples of the globalization. The technology is exported, and some Supreme Courts react to that in a different way. And the minority verdict of the 2018 judgment in India has been really emulated by other Supreme Courts in the world. Last points. You're very right, Anish, when you mentioned the post-Cargill development, and that's why we are back to security. And in the paper we explained that there were two competing initiatives. Adar was one, but there was another one promoted by Advani, by the Home Minister, and by the Home Ministry, in fact. And when Chidambaram was Home Minister, he was against Adar, against Mukherjee. He converted to Adar when he shifted to the Finance Ministry, because you saw institutions, and that's why it's a study of the state. Adar is really an entry point in the state, I would say, dynamism or dynamics. And this finally is joining hands today. I mean, there is a kind of probably fusion of or merging of the NPR and the Adar, and that will probably become one system. Why is, and that's the last point I wanted to make in relation to what Rahul was saying. Why do we see so much continuity between the UPA and the NDA in this particular domain? Well, certainly the IT sector is a very strong lobby. Certainly on both sides, security is also very much valued. And certainly technologism, this idea that you will solve problem by resorting to technology, even the problem of the poor, is also all pervasive. But I do think there is a difference. I do think that during the UPA regime, you had people who believe that, yes, that will help for development. That will certainly help the poor. Whereas on the NDA side, we clearly see an interest in the surveillance. And the next step may well reconfirm this. We are very close to a facial recognition system in India. We are very close to one more step in this direction, something that was certainly not on the agenda of the UPA. So there are many things in common. There is still a difference between the way Jairam Ramesh looked at Adar and the way Amit Shah is looking at Adar. You see, for me, it's a difference of degree, even more than degree, probably, in kind. Sorry, I've been too long again. Nicolas.
No, you have been very interesting too. So I would add to that a few things concerning the difference between the UPA and the BGP.
Once again, bring your mic in front, Nicolas.
Sorry. I would add a few things. First, concerning the difference between the UPA and the BGP periods. The UPA periods coincided with a time when Adar was still at least partially voluntary. At the beginning of the scheme, its promoters bet on the voluntary enrollment. It is the reason why they linked it to the ration cards or to the INREG. It was because they thought that in order to access their social benefits, people would enroll, but it would still remain at least voluntary. After 2014, the compulsory aspects came more and more forefront. So I think this is a difference between the two periods. The second point I wanted to make is about the role of the state, a question that has been raised. And what is the agency of different people and so on. So what is striking when you map what people say about Adar or what people do with Adar, is that it is strongly correlated with their position in the government or in the opposition. When people are in the opposition, they usually oppose Adar, for instance, for grounds of privacy, public liberty, or for simple political strategy. When the same people got into the government, they usually support Adar in speech and in acts, because the scheme is very interesting for the state. Someone quoted A.B. Pandey. We could also quote Ram Sevak Sharma. They are both IAS officers who are the most strongly supporting Adar. They are much more vocal than even Nilekani at some times. Why? Just because Adar is very useful for the state as a machinery. And so whatever the political color, whoever becomes in charge of an administration, he usually says, oh, yes, but yes, it's something good. Yeah, and about the global perspective, yes, of course. If you remember the different stakeholder at the beginning, you also have big tech companies like Omidyar or Microsoft, or the digital sector worldwide is interested in the development of such identifiers, because without it they cannot work. And I think they started in India because of the high IT level of the country. But the plan is to make it worldwide.
Thank you, Christophe, and thank you, Nicolas. I think I will just end with 3 remarks. And the first remark is something that you did not state in a definitive way in your presentation, but I think comes out as a very important way of understanding your presentation, especially for scholars like us who are also political scientists and scholars of area studies. You know, in my work on globalization, I was told that, you know, what's so great about the India story? You know, the entire world was globalizing. And I have to explain to them that no, it is different. It's not exactly the way Beijing does it. It's not exactly the way Washington wanted it, nor is it the way London wanted it. And that is also the take home from your story, which is that certainly we must look at the drivers of globalization. But as students of historically instituted, inspired students of area studies, I think there is a lot to be learned there, which is in the form of richness, which must also be conceptualized because it helps compare between regions and countries. It's not that it is just a coincidence that it is a kind of the shape of the Cleopatra's nose. I think it is a fundamental statement about how did India take this technology. From there, I think the next important issue is how was this technology taken? You know, what are the interests between what American political scientists or even Marxists would call a class-based analysis or an interest group kind of liberal mode of understanding? And there, I think both Christophe and Nicolas said that the state is very important. One of the things that I think a lot of students of South Asian politics do not agree very easily to is the fact that the moment you talk about the state, you have to talk about dominant ideas within the state. I mean, this is what the greatest American political scientists concede after they have retired and after they have graduated to the presidency of the American Political Science Association, but not when they were getting tenure. So therefore, you know, you can't just derive everything from material interests. And this is a problem in India as well, because of the, I think, the dominance of Marxism and class analysis in the dominant narrative. And finally, I would just like to reiterate that I began with the hope and a wish and a conviction that Christophe and Nicolas will certainly lead us on to something which will make us learn and think and ponder over. And thankfully, they have done that as they always do. And we are also proud to, we will also be very proud to present to you their working paper. In fact, we have a group of scholars who are a part of our mailing list. They always get these. And if some of you are interested, you can write to my colleague, Tanvi Deshpande at her email. Her email is available on our website. She's a Marie Curie fellow working in our department like Jayashankar Prasad. She handles our list, and we would be happy to add to that list of people who will not get bored by what excites us. Thank you very much, Christophe. Thank you very much, Nicolas. And thank you very much all for your participation, your help, and for making this such a lively occasion for us.
Thank you,
Thank you very much, Rahul.
Thank you all.
Thank you for
Thank you very
hosting
much.
us.
It's wonderful to see you, Christophe, a long time. Wonderful to see Rahul after a long time.
Yeah.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you that you can.
Bye-bye.
That you can all make it under these circumstances, and that reinforces my view that we are able to attract interesting ideas in this colloquium.
Of course.
And that reinforces and sort of we work. And of course, many of our research students attended as well because it's a part of my research colloquium.
Yeah. Right.
And Rahul, as you know, one advantage of online attendance, at least for me, is that I'm not get out, so that I can
Yes.
I can see participation in the program.
Yes. So in fact, when we have dealt with COVID,
Not get out is Vice Chancellor.
Bye-bye.
Bye. See you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye, Balveer. Take care. Bye.
You too.
Bye,
Bye.
Balveer.
Bye.
Nice seeing after a long time.
Bye. Lovely
Bye.
to see you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.